In the movies and on TV, the Indian has been portrayed either as the noble
The medicine man tried to scare away the evil spirits. The Indians believed him and felt reassured.
or ignoble savage. Even today, when one thinks about Indians, images of fry bread or powwows come to mind. And after seeing all these images that have worked to shape our perception about Indians, a question comes to mind. Have you ever wondered? What is a real Indian?
A real Indian? See, I have to think about that. If you would say, what's an Indian, that would be easier to answer. I think it's the real that trips me up. Because then, to me, that means there must be something that is an unreal Indian. You have to have the negative, and I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think you're Indian or you're not. But I don't know about the real.
Blah. A well, answers I've given to that question before, that I don't necessarily believe now, or my ideas have changed. What is a real Indian? Someone who, at some point in their life, didn't want to be an Indian. I think that might include a part of the definition. Being federally enrolled helps. There's less bureaucracy, but I understand all sorts of Indians are not. There's also a basic cultural knowledge test. Can you answer 10 basic questions about your tribe's history and Native American history in general? Maybe that's in there. In the end, I suppose, though, there's one way of being Indian for each Indian. So there's approximately 2.8 million ways of being a real Indian.
That's a tough one. For me, I guess, I'll just use my own personal experience, because it's something that I've struggled with, identifying myself as American Indian, as Native American. My grandfather was Creek, and he was always very, very proud of who he was. But he was also very independent. Now, he did work very hard to organize the tribe in our community, but he always felt that he didn't have to defend who he was to anyone. And I guess he kind of instilled that in me.
What is a real Indian? Real Indians live in India. That's what a real Indian is. Real Indian won't eat a cow. Won't eat any beef. Real Indian. Yeah. All right. And in the actual factuality of reality, there aren't any Indians here. We're not even really Native Americans, because we're older than America. As a people, right, we're older than America. And America is a concept that's been here 200 or 300 years. Well, we're older than the concept.
I don't believe enrollment makes you a real Indian. I don't believe that having a card from a tribe means that I am more Indian or less Indian. And I appreciate that enrollment serves purposes. I really do. But the idea of quantum as a requirement to be considered definitionally Indian, I believe, is an extermination policy. I really do. I think the federal government had the forethought to know that if you require a particular quantum, there will be intermarriage, and then eventually there will be no more Indians, enrollable Indians. As I'm saying that, I'm thinking, well, gee, does that change my definition of who is Indian? It really doesn't, I don't think, but it does to the feds and to most tribes. And I know that you have to have some form of enrollment process because that enables the tribe to provide services like social services or provide, you know, hunting and fishing, treaty rights. I appreciate all of that. But I don't believe that any of those rights should be provided to me via quantum. It's funny because I get lost. Like my train of thought goes off as I'm telling the story. You know, I'm talking about quantum and how I don't think that has anything to do with whether or not you're Indian. I really don't. But at the same time, I have to realize that for trust responsibility and for the political distinction of Native persons, there has to be a definition. I don't know what that definition should be. Should it be descendancy? Because then, you know, it is linked to your family, your ancestors, but quantum doesn't matter. And that way you can still, you know, have a trust responsibility, even though it's been eroded and it hardly exists anymore. But the trust responsibility is just to ensure that the culture and that the people can continue to grow and flourish by way of providing for economic development, for providing for education, in providing health care. And the federal government, through cases, has time and time again limited what that responsibility is. And it's frustrating. You know, but outside law, I mean, it's just good practice for humans. I mean, I could do a legal analysis, but I don't see it that way. I see it more sociologically. I see it as a responsibility that's moral.
Indian identity has almost exclusively become something physical. The way you look, or the way you dress, or the way you act, and it's very surface. Well, it's interesting how my hair and the length of my hair has become such an issue, or the style of my hair was such an issue. I wore a mullet for a long time, and I knew it was out of style in terms of pop culture, and it was out of style in my class, what I did for a living. You know, and it got cute and fashionable to hammer on mullets, which is serious class-based issues, you know, which is really elitist. And so I enjoyed wearing the mullet after that as well, just to fight against elitism. But I wore it because it's a reservation hairstyle. And I didn't want to lose my connection to the res. So my hairstyle as a mullet was sort of the last gasp effort to retain my reservation identity. If not intellectually and emotionally or physically, at least, I mean, geographically, at least physically. That I don't live there, I won't ever live there. I don't speak my language, I don't dance, but I'm from there. I grew up there and my family's still there. So, I mean, my hairstyle was nostalgia. I was guilty of nostalgia and thinking I had to look a certain way to send a message to people about Indianness. And then when I just started wearing it all one length, which was more Indian fashionable, and people loved it. And I got so many comments about the hair constantly. And then when I cut it, because my dad died, which was the ironic thing that my fans didn't know why I cut my hair when 99% of them have seen Smoke Signals, where Victor cuts his hair because his dad dies. And it became such a subject during the book tour last year. Every reading, somebody asked a question and everybody would laugh because it was funny to talk about the Indian's hair. You know, that was a measure of identity, was hair. And now that I've cut my hair, I've become even more ambiguous, my identity. Which is weird because on my res, I'm dark. Among the Spokane Indians, I'm dark. And I also grew up in eastern Washington, which is sunny 300 days a year, so I was darker skinned than I am now. And I'm a writer who lives in Seattle, so I'm pale as hell right now. So, you know, and with short hair, I blend now into Seattle. I could be Asian, I could be Mexican, I could be Middle Eastern, I could be Italian, you know, I could be generic Northern European, I could be, you know, some dark German descendant, I could be just a white mutt, I could be half of anything. And earlier on in my career, that would have bothered me, and it did bother me when people didn't know what I was, or people commented, you know, you don't look Indian. And now I don't care. I am not interested in sending obvious and shallow signals to people about who I am. I'd no sooner wear turquoise, you know, or Dreamcatcher earrings, or, you know, I mean, I've seen Indians show up at readings and artists, you know, wearing ribbon shirts and you know, that just feels to me like costumes.
Anyway, what I was thinking about when you were asking the question, what I was thinking about in terms of my identity as a Creek, is that I never really gave it much thought when I was growing up. I mean, I had people, from the time I was a little kid, I had other little kids saying, "What are you?" You know, and I would think, well, "What do you mean? What am I?" "Well, you look different. Are you white?" And I would ask my mother, well, what does that mean? And she would say, well, you're Creek. Tell them you're Creek. Well, nobody would know what that is, or maybe some people would, but not for the most part. And so I would just say, well, I'm American Indian, which is really what I grew up calling myself, American Indian. And then, of course, people said, well, Native American is the correct way to call yourself. And my grandfather would just say, oh, we're Creek, just, you know. He'd get so irritated. And I would talk with my grandfather about it a little bit, and he never really liked to talk that much about it, but as he got older, he would share more, and he would cry a lot, and he would say things that to me didn't really make sense. He would talk about not being allowed to go to school. He would talk about his mother being afraid to say that she was Native and that she would never talk about it. She didn't want to acknowledge it. And he would talk about how, and this would have been my great-grandmother, how she was always afraid that somebody was going to come take her to Oklahoma. She lived that way her whole life. And it sounded so strange to me, and I remember thinking, that can't be possible. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration. It just doesn't make sense. And then when I got into college and I really started studying the history, especially in the Southeast, for the Native peoples there, I realized that her fears were totally real. Her family had hid. They had escaped being taken to Oklahoma, and what they had to do, and the whole community that stayed behind, had to assimilate. They were forced to assimilate to keep from being taken away. And so there's this real history of shame and fear and guilt. And in fact, years later, the Creek Nation in Oklahoma said, there aren't any Creeks in Florida. We were all taken to Oklahoma. I mean, that really hurt the Creek community in the Southeast, because it was just, okay, on the one hand, we've been forced to lie about who we are and hide and be afraid, and now we're being told, what's the word I'm looking for? not invalidated, but it's like being robbed twice. So I was thinking about that, and I thought, you know, that has stayed with, I can still see it in my family, that the more I read about it, actually I was reading about this, really doing some research, and I just had this feeling like, oh my God, I can't believe this. The hiding and the fear and the shame and the assimilation, and I realized, thinking about how my own family has behaved, just real quiet, not wanting to talk too much about it, that it had been passed down, and it's still like that.
We are the victims of genocide. You know, harshness and brutality was imposed upon us. You know, I mean, going back as children, from our childhood on, over the last 200, 300 years, harshness and brutality has been imposed upon us. So we're now at a point in our lives, right, in our lives where we, as Indians, you know, reality, Indians quarrel, Indians don't get along, Indians, yeah, I mean, Indians, there's a whole long negative behavior list that goes along with being with Indians, you know, and this is reality. But as human beings, when we were the human beings and the people by our own names, and when we were that, we lived, we cooperated, we worked together. Many of the things that keep the Indians apart, when we were the human beings, we weren't kept apart. You know, and so to me, that's really what it's all, you know, I've heard, you know, who's more Indian, who's less Indian, you know, and it's like, you know, who wants, it's like, sometimes I wonder, what's going on here, fighting over the lie? Who's a bigger part of the lie, you know, who gets to, you know, it's, so we need to have some clarity about it, and because my main concern about it is that, see, what Western civilization does is it erases the ancestral tribal memory from those that it gobbles up, colonizes. It erases their memory. See, and we're in a generation now where we have fragments of the original memory, but we don't have it all. We have fragments. And we fight with those fragments, or we disagree with those fragments, or we try to pretend to ourselves those fragments are the whole. So there's a lot of, you know, a lot of don't walk the talk, or don't talk the walk stuff going on, because we're trying to make fragments the whole. And so I think that we, as Native people, right, have to remember is that as the human beings and as the people, our history goes back to the beginning of the creation story. As Indians, our history starts with the arrival of the Europeans. Indians on this continent don't have a history before the arrival of Columbus. That's when the history of the Indians started. All right, and with that history of the Indians starting with the arrival of Columbus, all right, so did the terrorization. Right? See, so the history of the Indian, the whole history and identity of the Indian, creation of that for us, right, was imposed upon us, and then indoctrinated into us through basically terrorism. It's a word they like to use now. All right, terrorism. Terrorism was conducted against us, all right, by the evil forces. Take that. You know, but what happened? All right. And that's what was used. So if you go back and you look at the Indians amongst us, you know, a lot of the negative behavior patterns and traits that we exhibit, it's because of that. Because the Indians, when you look at the Indians, the history of the Indians, they don't have any positive. It's all bad things happened. The positive is, well, the noble red man. Yeah, well, thank you, but, you know, I'd rather be, you know, I think I'd like more reality than just be the noble red man. I want to be a living human being, living the way I'm supposed to live, you know. Keep your noble stuff. Keep your noble stuff. I just want to be alive and free.
When you say, what is a real Indian, I have to think, okay, what is a real Indian metaphysically? What is a real Indian politically? What is a real Indian economically? And it's interesting that I see it that way, because now I've made these categories and I've divided it all up, when one of the first things I wanted to talk about was that I was 100% human, and I'm not a pile of percentages. But I suppose that I am, in some respect, a pile of categories, if I have to think about it in that way.
You know, my idea about identity has changed a lot since September 11th. And before September 11th, I was much more fundamental about what I thought a real Indian was or wasn't. And it was that sort of thinking and tribalism and fundamentalism and my own narrow mind, you know, it was not dissimilar from the 19 jerk-offs in those planes, you know, who were flying the planes into the building because they thought they knew what a, you know, real Christian is, or a real Muslim is, or a real human being is. So in some ways, I've just let it go.
We like to be able to categorize things neatly and to be able to say, oh, what are you? Oh, you're this, you're that. So in some ways, it's just an extension of that need to be able to neatly categorize something. And that's something that's always been problematic for me, because I don't fit neatly into any category. And it really stymies people, and they don't know what to do with that. Well, you can't be this and this. You can't be Native American and Jewish. You can't, why not? You know? What, I can't exist? You know, excuse me while I leave the planet, because I guess I don't neatly fit into one of these little boxes.
When I started at Alcatraz, when I first went into the activist movement, you know, I was young and hot-headed and, you know, kill the whites. No. No, but I mean, had attitude, really attitude, right? But, you know, this old medicine man said to me, you know, and I didn't really like what he was saying at the time. I mean, but he was telling me a truth, and I had to learn to understand it. But he said, it doesn't matter. All of the human beings' blood is red.